morning and welcome. Tonight I'm going to talk about the Bennington Triangle. That all started a couple of months ago when I was still chair of ASSAP, when somebody mentioned the Bridgewater Triangle. And I must admit that I'm a bit of a skeptic about triangles. Now, I don't mean that in maths class I stood up and said, Pythagoras was a liar. There is no such thing as isosceles. Go away. I refute these angles. No, not like that. No, it was the Bermuda Triangle. Can any of you remember back to 1976 when Barry Manilow appeared on Top of the Pops? Except he didn't. His record appeared on the Top of the Pops. Bermuda Triangle makes people disappear. Bermuda Triangle, don't come too near. And they actually had Pam's people or Legs and Co. I can't remember which of the dance troupes it was, wearing bathing suits and prancing around and occasionally jumping into a paddling pool filled with water. Well, that was the 1970s. Fortunately, we've come a long way since then. And I think Barry Manilow's career went quite a long way after that as well. But the reason why Barry Manilow was singing about the Bermuda Triangle in 1976 was in 1975, Charles Berlitz, scion of the owner of the language school, the son thereof, came forward with a magnificent book called The Bermuda Triangle. I read it when I was 10 years old, 11 years old, something like that. I was younger than that, actually. I was 6 or 7 years old. But I read it and I was entranced. And since that time, I have read everything I can find on the Bermuda Triangle. Sadly, one of the first things I read was Larry Cush's book, The Bermuda Triangle Solved, in which he says it's all a load of bunk. And actually, the only mystery about the Bermuda Triangle is how publicists still manage to sell stuff on it, because nearly all of the incidents there come down to bad weather. Anyway, after the Bermuda Triangle had its heyday in the 1970s, the triangle notion kind of left the paranormal world for a while. Lauren Coleman came up with a fantastic idea about equally placed equidistant zones of strangeness around the world. If you had a 20-sided dice, you could probably represent them quite accurately. I think there were 12 zones, he believes, scattered equally around the world. 6 in the northern hemisphere, 6 in the southern hemisphere. And since that time, there have been various other triangle theorists. There was a brief period when the Essex Triangle became a fashionable thing, but sadly, that was not mysterious disappearances and paranormal activity and Bigfoot, though Bigfoot in white high heels would definitely be worth seeing. No, that was actually, very sadly, nothing more than a series of high-profile murder cases which occurred in Essex, England. And I think that might come down to the fact that, if you think about it, Essex is quite close to London. So the people who live in Essex often are people who are commuting out of London, they have money, and perhaps it's a nice rural retreat for those who dabble in well, anyway, let's not get too much into the details of Essex, but I'm sure that sociology and criminology would tell us more about the reasons why the Essex Triangle came into existence than the paranormal. In recent years, however, 2 new triangles have raised their heads. One of them is called the Bridgewater Triangle. Sadly, not Bridgewater, Somerset. That would be magnificent. I mean, I don't think there's factories there anymore. But at the end of the day, Bridgewater, Somerset, if people went there to disappear, that would be. However, I think you've still got the Sheep Worrying Theatre Company at Bridgewater and various other youth endeavours. Brian Smedlin, the Hot Trot Smash the System Boogie Band, people like that. But I don't think that it's that Bridgewater. It's actually Bridgewater, Connecticut. However, there is another triangle, and this one is called the Bennington Triangle. And the reason it's named that is actually after a ladies' college. So I suppose the Cheltenham equivalent would be if we named a triangle after the Cheltenham Ladies' College. The Bennington College for Young Ladies was founded in about 1916. I didn't actually get any pictures of it, but it's every bit as scenic and as you would imagine an American ladies' college to be. It had a very liberal syllabus, and they didn't grade their students. right from the beginning. They never graded you from A to F. You didn't fail your course in that sense. Instead, twice a year, you would get a report, and you didn't follow a set syllabus. You came up with a series of studies and attended lessons and lectures based upon what you were trying to endeavor to become. And you didn't necessarily have to do final exams. You could paint a mural or make a pot, or as long as you were doing something useful and creative. So it's a bit like those kind of hippie free schools that came around in the 60s and 70s, or some of the other more innovative free experimental projects. But Bennington has a reputation as being a very highly regarded and successful school. And it will be featuring in our talk today. Right, let's move on. So how did the Bennington Triangle, pictured on the right, come about? It's in Northeast America. I'll show you exactly where in a moment. And it actually came about through the efforts of one man, Joseph A. Citro. Make a note of that name. You'll hear it a few times tonight. Joseph wrote a book. In fact, he's now written 14 books, including 4 novels, one of which is set in the so-called Bennington Triangle. And one of the theories he put forward in his collections of ghost laws and paranormal phenomena was that this is what experts in America call a portal, or a window area where spooky things happen. And therefore, you don't get one kind of anomalous phenomena, you get loads of them all in the same area. And I mean, there are places like that in the UK. Peter McHugh's written a wonderful book called Zones of Strangeness, which covers a lot of this material. And those places would be the obvious place to send ASSAP members, starting with Peter McHugh. However, I'm just trying to think of some examples. What's it called? Not Clapham Common, the Common down on Chanctonbury Ring and all that area around there. Not Clapham Common, is it? It might be Clapham. No, it's not Clapham Common. Chanctonbury Ring, anyway, in that area down there on in the south coast of England. Rendlesham, Leiston, that kind of area where the UFO incident happened, and where people like Brenda Butler have reportedly seen all kinds of strange anomalies over the years. And there's a number of other places scattered around the UK which have got a lot of strange phenomena in a very small space. So this is roughly the triangle as he imagined it. It follows a major road which runs from Massachusetts entirely across the state, and its center is a mountain called Glastonbury, with an E, not with an O, not Glastonbury Tor. Even more confusing, Glastonbury is close to Shaftesbury and also Somerset. And in fact, at the time we'll be talking about tonight, both of those towns had largely ceased to exist. They have grown up a bit more since, but they had ceased to be important centres, and there was hardly anything there. Tonight's sources, I made extensive use of Michael C. Dooling, who at the University of Washington has put a load of newspaper articles from the archives from his research in his wonderful book. It really is a great read, Clueless in New England. I'm not going to have time tonight to talk about Connie Smith, Catherine Hell. I might mention them in passing, but I will be mentioning Paula Weldon in quite a lot of detail. But Michael is a very thorough academic, patient researcher, and he doesn't come to any strong conclusions about these disappearances. He does explain why they became important in Vermont and why they're still, in a sense, important today. So that's a book I would definitely recommend if you're interested in what I'm talking about tonight. Right, let's start with the mystery. So, first of all, is it true that ancient spirits walk the mountains? Is it true that aliens or Sasquatch or something is abducting people? Is it true that there is an ancient dark folklore of this triangle? Surprisingly, yes, to some extent. But the actual reason that the triangle has become famous comes down to 5 years. And those were the years from 1945 to 1950. And in that period, there were 5 fairly high-profile disappearances. There have been a few others over the years, which are circumstantially linked, but really these are the 5 which actually fall within the triangle or close to the triangle, and which have come to be regarded as triangle cases. It's a bit like Jack the Ripper, where people argue exactly how many of the victims were his and how many belonged to others. If you look at the map on the left, there is Boston, which I believe is roughly the same level as Madrid and south of Spain. Unfortunately for the Americans, the climate's very different, and Vermont in the winter is prone to snowdrifts. And in fact, I think Stephen King wrote an entire novel where one of his characters is snowed in after he suffers a car crash and is trapped with a mad fan. Anyway, if the area of Bennington, I've marked it here, so it's just above New York, Philadelphia, Washington, and Boston. So it's sort of the very northern part of North America, close to the Canadian border, not that far actually from Montreal or Toronto. And the cases that I will be discussing tonight are Midi Rivers, 1945, Paula Weldon, 1946, James Tedford, 1949, Paul Jepson, 1950, and Frida Langer, 1950. And I will endeavour to give my sources and to explain. So the question I have to ask is, do these cases constitute a paranormal phenomena? 5 people disappeared in 5 years. Was it A, aliens, B, a serial killer, C, pure chance, or D, is there something else going on? Well, let's have a look at each case in turn and make a decision, because at the end of the night, I'm going to tell you now, you're going to have to make up your own mind as to whether or not the Bennington Triangle is a thing, but the mystery will stay a mystery. Right, firstly, let's just look at where exactly it is. And I can't actually work out for the life of me why I've put this map on here, because it's the area to the south of where I want. Oh no, there's Albany. So it's over here somewhere. There's Bennington. Okay, so there's Wilmington. So that means that Brattleboro's there. Okay, so on the map, you'll see that there is a lighter area. That's the state of Vermont. Over to the right, you've got Massachusetts, and over to the left and below is New York State. And this is the very bottom of Vermont State. And have any of you been to Vermont? If you have, the southern part of it, at least, and I think most of it, has the Green Mountains and various other mountain ranges. And it's incredibly rugged, but on a scale we don't get in England. It's, oh, okay, that's interesting. So the area we're going to be looking at is the area around Glastonbury Mountain. Down there's Bennington College, the aforesaid Ladies' College, which is a little walk out of town. Up to the top, it's just, you know, forestry. And the important bit is you'll see Highway 7 that runs northeast, and running more or less parallel to that and across the top of Glastonbury Mountain up this way, there is a trail called the Long Trail. Now, back in the early 20th century, hiking was becoming a thing in America. And the Americans had the foresight to make some massive national parks quite early. But before that, they laid down hiking trails. And there's a 270-mile long hiking trail that you can walk. And all the way along it, they had cabins where you could stay the night. I forget what the English term is for them, or the Scottish term. Oh, what do you call them? The little places where you can just stay overnight. It'll come to me in a minute, but anyway. So they had cabins where you could stay, and they have lean-tos, and wardens would go out there and leave food and supplies in case anyone got lost on the path or ran out, got caught. And in the summer, the trail's quite popular. And it proved so popular, this trail, that ran from Vermont all the way up to Canada and across the border, that people used it. But sooner or later, it came to inspire an even longer trail, over 1,000 miles long, which runs along the top of the mountains, which is called the Appalachian Trail. And a section of the Appalachian Trail is also part of the Long Trail. So that gives you an idea. It's a major American hiking route through rugged, wild, natural landscapes. And That's the kind of terrain we're talking about that lies north of this small college town in America. Let's move on. Just to give you a quick idea of how rugged it is, there's a shelter up there. That's just about the top of Glastonbury Mountain. Hang on, I'll try and... Oh, no, go back. I can't remember how you do this. There is a way that if I hold down the mouse or something, there we go. So this is the top of Glastonbury Mountain where the red dot is. There's the college down there. And the long trail used to run up here. And now it runs a bit further along, but nobody cares. Let's just move on. Mountains, college students. What could possibly go wrong? Okay. Here's another picture. You can't see the mountains, and the reason why is because that green stuff is the tops of the trees. They are blanketed in trees, and you'll see the patches, which are gaps in the trees. Hollows, they're often called, where the rivers run through, and there's a small area of meadow and grazing, but most of it is thickly forested woodland. So, 1945, Midi Rivers. It's a fairly straightforward thing. He was a veteran of the area. He'd been there his whole life. He was 74 years old, a hunter and a fisherman. He made a foo bob, acting as a guide to those who would go out into the woods hunting deer. And on the weekend he met whatever fate he met, there was a massive bear shot out in those forests. One of the largest bears shot in the region in history. Also, in the same period, though, there were a couple of massive stags shot, and there was a lot of good hunting. And it was quite common for people to go into the forest and stay 2 or 3 days in one of the cabins, of which there were many. Some people had built their own cabins, and they're still there today. There's a lot of homesteads in the forest now. But in this period, they were more an area you went, stayed while you were hunting, you brought back the deer and presumably ate it. He was asked by his son-in-law if he'd like to go along, and he went along with a hunting party. 4 of them decided to go into the woods, taking him with them. Joe Lawson Jr., the son-in-law, invited good old, reliable Midi Rivers. And Midi set out with a gun. Now, Midi actually had spent, as I said, his whole life in the area. He knew it really well. And, hang on, go back a couple. He took them to an area where they often hunted, which is called Bickford Dell. Where? Go back, previous. How did I do that before? Hold my hand, there you go. Bickford Dell is this area here. And it is a hollow, a valley where you can hunt for deer, where you can camp, where there's water and a stream that runs through it. And just to the north of it, there is another dell. And for some reason, when people are talking about this case, they always talk about the other dell, never talk about Bickford's Dell, which is where he actually was. I wonder why they prefer to talk about Devil's Dell. So this is Devil's Dell, this is Bickford's Dell down here. And for some reason, as I say, people stress the northern part, not the southern, but he was in Bickford's Dell. He was seen to walk off from the campsite, and he said, I'm going to go out, I'm going to go hunting. The problem was that there are ridges, which are represented by the edge of the valley, and where if you go up, you can just about make out that the trees on here. In fact, if we go back again, so he's up here in the dells, but over here, can you see the big ridges and how the valleys are separated from one another by mountains or by heights? He did not know the other side. He only knew the mile or so around where he was. But he said, don't worry, I'm not going to go over the ridge. I won't be far. I'll be back shortly. I'll be back by 3. And he walked off. Well, that night, there was no sign of him. And being 74 years old, his friends and relatives were concerned, and the hunting guys went out into the woods looking for him. And the traditional way, if you're ever hunting, that you signal that you're looking for someone is you fire 2 shots into the air. So you don't fire them straight up in case they come down on top of you. Angle off to one side, fire 2 shots, and then you listen for somebody firing back. Now, he had his pipe with him, he had a gun with him, but he did not have, and this is quite important, a blanket, a sleeping bag, or any food. In fact, they offered to give him some cake or something to take with him as he was leaving the rest of the party. And he said, "Oh, no, I'm going out to look for deer. I'll be back shortly. I'll be back by 3." Anyway, the hunt went on for him throughout the night. And in the morning, they realized they weren't going to find him. 74-year-old hunter lost for 2 days is the first newspaper article from the Bennington paper. I forget what it's called, but the Bennington Press. And they immediately began a massive community effort. Now, you might think he's only been missing for a day and a half, but it was getting cold at night. This was in November, and snow was quite likely. The temperature was dropping below freezing, and they wondered if he'd fallen and broken an arm or a leg. There was nothing likely to have happened to him that was bad. So they decided that they would attract everybody. Everybody from the paper mill where he worked, Benmont Papers, came out to help. And in the morning, at 6 a.m., the superintendent of fire alarms fired off 3 times the town's fire alarm in a short-coded signal, which everybody in the town recognized as meaning emergency. All of the men ran down to the fire station to find out what the problem was, and they were immediately told that he was missing, that the weather wasn't going to be good. It was being mild so far, but at any time it could get worse, and that Middy could end up dead. And at least 100 people turned out on the first day. Not just 100 people, they also made appeals, and somebody brought out an aeroplane. And aeroplanes were to feature quite extensively. This is 1945, it's the end of the Second World War. Lots of people have learned how to fly aircraft, and there are aircraft around, and they flew them over the forest to search for him. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been involved in search and rescue in a forest, but essentially you can walk within arm's length of a body, and unless you smell it, you will not see it. Search teams, time and time again, they work, 10 feet apart, 20 feet apart. They walk through the woods. You mark the trees with something like confetti or rice or something biodegradable so that you don't do any damage, but you mark the path you're taking and you do systematic searching. And we often think that's quite a new thing, but no, that was well known at the time. And they really did. They used the confetti method. They went into the woods and they combed the whole of Bickford's Dell, Devil's Dell, down to the main road, and they found nothing. On day 3, the fire chief, Wallace Madison, was becoming frustrated. He needed 400 people, he decided, that day to do a proper hunt through the forest again. It was the last chance, and no one turned up. Well, 40 people turned up. He had another aeroplane that day, and it flew over the forest repeatedly, but there was no sign of poor old Middy. By this time, people were beginning to assume that he was dead, and Middy's fate was put down to either heart failure or stroke or some other disease of old age, or a fall in the forest, which is rough terrain, you'll see that in a moment, or alternatively, some kind of fall into the river, drown incident. So, as the planes were going over, the Civil Air Patrol flights in the state were told he was missing and began to fly across. And people were looking through the woods really well. And when I was looking for this, on the day he went missing, I found this. Must be Vermont Panther on his way to Florida. Potsdam, Philadelphia, November the 14th. The nocturnal tramp of a posse combing the woods of nearby Sheep's Hill for a mysterious beast that makes 20-foot leaps, cries and screams like a baby and steals chickens is not good for the nerves. Especially, says Mrs. Edward Krieger of Sheep's Hill. To me, she complained to police that hunting parties trespass across her property and take pot shots at any black shadows late at night. Maybe I'll start shooting myself, she said, if this nonsense doesn't stop. Meanwhile, the Thing, as residents in the area have tagged the mystery animal, is responsible for 4 casualties amongst those who have stalked it the past 5 days. People reported William J. Brandel, 18-year-old Potsdam youth, struck in the thigh by a pumpkin ball bullet. Belle Hart, 17, of nearby Douglasville, was injured in the left arm by a trigger-nervous posse member, and a young couple, tracking the thing by also, was seriously injured when a frightening screech caused the driver to lose control of the car. Variously, it's been described as a panther, a puma, can't read what that is, but some kind of wild chow dog, maybe, a bear, and a black fox. But until the prowling beast, shrieking beast it's just the thing of Sheep's Hill. Sorry, I'm missing part of the text. But yeah, so there was at the time a legend of a black panther who stalked his way through Vermont and ate sheep. Did that actually exist? Obviously, Philadelphia, Pottstown, is quite a distance away. It's to the south, but it is maybe 100 miles off. But there was apparently a rumor that there was a panther. Why would you need black panthers when you have wildcats and mountain lions? I don't know. Anyway, cryptids will appear from time to time. Now, the only reason I saw that article was it was on the same page of the same newspaper from 1945 as the first article on Midi River's disappearance. And here is where he went missing today. You can see Bickford Hollow. There's a house, I think it might actually be a church there now. There's a series of small huts and caravans, and people still go there, still stay there, and there are various holiday camping spots around. In fact, there's another house up there, I think it is. I don't know if you can see that, in the woods, the top left-hand corner. And just around the corner is the wonderfully named Hell Hollow Brook, which is a stream that crosses the road. And there is a river, where the river goes under the road, there is a small bridge. And at the time of our second disappearance, both the Bickford Hollow Bridge and the Hell Hollow Bridge were just wooden planks across the stream. Now, the problem with him having drowned in either of those is I've looked at them. I don't know how deep they'd be in November, but in September, they look like they're about 2 to 4 inches deep. They're very shallow. So I don't think it's likely that he would have drowned. Could he have fallen into the water, icy cold water in September, had a heart attack and been swept away? Possibly. At the very end of the search, after 2 weeks, they finally found a cartridge in the same caliber as his rifle that was laying in the river. And it was suggested that he had dropped a cartridge, bent down to pick it up, toppled over, fallen in the water, his heart had failed, and he'd washed away. Now, anyone who knows anything about water search and rescue will know that bodies usually take at least 9 days to come to the surface. The colder the weather, the longer it takes for a body to surface. And so it's very, very hard, even if you're doing fingertip search, to locate a body on the bottom of a riverbed. We've seen cases like that recently. It's a common problem with people who go missing is they're usually in water. The question is finding it. But 4 inches deep, you can see every rock on the bottom of Hell Hollow Brook. I've looked at it quite closely, and I do not think there is any way at all that I can see. I mean, I could be completely wrong because I'm not local, and it could be further down, it's much deeper and much faster. Or maybe it was in flood at the time. Nonetheless, Midi's disappearance was considered to be a great mystery. And eventually a source of solution was put forward, which was, while he was out in the woods, wearing, I believe somebody said, a red jacket or a red pullover, he was accidentally shot and killed. He was moving through the woods, which were, after all, fairly full of people hunting deer. And as he was moving through the woods, another hunter, possibly a young and inexperienced one, was waiting with his gun on a rock, waiting for a deer to break cover. He heard something, whatever it was, came crashing through the trees towards him. He raised his gun, shot, and heard something fall, went over and realized he'd killed a man. And at that point, perhaps he concealed the body. And if he did, he concealed it well. On the other hand, it is incredibly easy for people to go missing in woodland areas. There was a very tragic case about a decade ago of a grandmother who was hiking. She went off the track with her tent to use the toilet and got lost and could not find her way back. And she was, I think, about 30 meters from the actual trail. And despite a massive search effort, they did not find her until she had been dead for a month or so. She'd survived for a couple of weeks, writing notes and eating the food she had, and eventually she had succumbed. But she had always been within shouting range of the trail, yet somehow had never been found. And she had a tent, a stove, supplies, and a mobile phone, albeit the battery had failed. So, you know, at the end of the day, once you're lost in one of these parks, I don't think it's particularly paranormal. But the case of Midi is certainly an interesting one. And yeah, it's good that he's remembered, I guess. So that was 1945. And now we come to the case that I actually wanted to talk about because it is one of the quintessential American mysteries, the case of Paula Jean Weldon. Paula Jean Weldon was the daughter of a designer, an industrial designer from New York. Him and his wife were upper middle class. She was beautiful, talented, and she was a student at Bennington. She had a fairly quiet life, and after her disappearance, she became an American icon, the blonde girl who was never seen again. And what happened with her? There's so many elements to this mystery, and I'm going to make some quite controversial assertions later, which hopefully won't get me in trouble, because I worked out that if anyone was alive still from her generation, they'd be 88 years old, and they're unlikely to be spending their time watching YouTube videos. So hopefully nobody will be too offended. But I'm also going to be respectful of the fact that she has family. Much more respectful, in fact, than Shirley Jackson. Have any of you ever seen or read The Haunting of Hill House? Apparently, it's an American ghost classic. I have never seen it. I've never read it. Apparently, she's an amazing authoress. I made the mistake of reading another one of her novels, Hangs a Man. And she was a lecturer starting a couple of years after this. In fact, she might have been there at the time, I think. Yeah, anyway, she was a lecturer at Bennington College. I think she might have arrived just after this happened. And she knew full well the story. She knew what had happened. And she wrote the entire novel, Hangs a Man, in which the heroine is Paula Jean Weldon, the disappearing girl. And it's about her home life and events that lead up to her going to college. And it's a psychological novel, and it's pretty much unreadable. I mean, I read the first half of it before finally just deciding, no, I'm not enjoying this in the slightest. I'm just finding it really depressing and hard going. And yeah. Now, she actually freely admitted it was based on the Paula Jean Weldon case. Clearly, it's a piece of fiction. The names are different, But in the novel, what actually happens is a deeply privileged, brilliant young woman has got a neurotic mother and a father who is just all about show and about having garden parties and about inviting people round. And one of his guests sexually assaults her. And as a result of that, the family tell her basically to shut up, or the father and her fall out over it, and nothing happens, and she's sent off to college, and she was going to college anyway. And the rest of the novel deals with what follows that. As I said, I can't tell you what happens at the end because I've never read it, so I won't give you spoilers. There is also another classic American novel which was inspired directly by Paula Jean Weldon. I've totally forgotten the name of it, but if you look up later the Wikipedia entry on the Bennington Triangle, it's referenced there. So within a couple of years of her disappearance, two major American novelists have written books inspired by her story. So this is an iconic kind of 1950s heroine. What did Paula really look like? Who was the real Paula Jean Weldon? Well, that seems to be the heart of the mystery here. She'd gone to Bennington in 1945, and she'd been at Bennington from the September, October time, and she was there a month after she arrived. She almost certainly participated in some of the searches around the edge of Bennington, or at least the boys she knew would have from the local businesses, etc., and who the girls used to hang out with, would have been involved in going day by day into the woods looking for Middy. Aeroplanes were crossing the skies. She knew the wilderness was dangerous. She knew that a hunter had gone missing. Also, she would have remembered the Boy Scouts and the Army. 400 soldiers were brought and were billeted and were made to search the woods systematically. The Boy Scouts were brought out and were made to search the woods. $4 a day were offered to volunteers, though no one accepted it. And so even more people came out and searched the woods, but Middy was not found. She would have remembered all of that from her first year. At the end of her first year, she had been a successful student. Like her father, she wanted to be an artist, but she didn't like the art course. She really was not getting on with the art teachers. She thought her art teacher might actually be a bit crap, and she was disappointed in herself. But she had one very close friend, Elizabeth, who was her whole world. Elizabeth and her were roommates. They got on absolutely brilliant. They're totally different in temperament. She was the privileged daughter of a New York designer, and Elizabeth was a girl who'd grown up on a ranch somewhere out Ohio way, I believe, and she was much more about animals and climbing and, like my friend Mandy, who used to spend her time, apparently when she was young, getting drunk and jumping off a water tower into the water pool because there was nothing else to do. So that was the difference between Elizabeth and Paula. Paula was actually considered at the time to be an incredible beauty, or so people said, though others have said she wasn't particularly, was she? But here's a colorized picture of Paula, and I think there is something very striking about her, isn't there? I mean, she was young. I don't think she'd even turned 19 at the beginning of her second year. University courses in America in this period were 4 years, usually, and she was only entering the second year. She'd passed perfectly fine, but she had lost interest in art and was getting much more into botany and into plants. And whenever they went out on a field trip, she was the one who got most excited. And Elizabeth, I get the impression, was also into botany and plants. And Elizabeth loved to go hiking in the wilderness. And very quickly, it became clear that so did Paula. Paula really enjoyed it. And when it came to the big Christmas or end of term ball, and they were all going to go dancing with properly, approved boys from the other colleges who'd come over to meet them and date them, she wasn't interested. She went off with Elizabeth and a bunch of others, and they camped on a mountain. They got soaking wet and persuaded a farmer to let him sleep in their barn. They did some barn dancing. And when they got back, everyone said, "Oh, well, did you go lovemaking? Was that what it was? It was all about you and the boys having a good time, was it? You were all going lovemaking up on the hills." And Elizabeth and her said no. Apparently, she seemed utterly shocked at the idea that she would be engaging in any kind of sexual activity. No, absolutely not. That's not what it's about. We were just having fun. We were just, barn dancing and laughing and climbing, and, we just had fun. And one thing that very quickly became clear about her to her friends was she didn't like boys who went pancakey, who tried it on. She didn't like handsy boys, and she didn't like emotional boys. And basically, she didn't seem to be really that keen on boys, full stop. She'd go on dates with them, usually double dating with Elizabeth, but she showed no sign whatsoever of actually wanting a boyfriend. There was one poor lad who she'd been on dates with several times, but who she was quite vocal about the fact she was certainly never going to do anything with him. There was no chance of marriage or romance. It was merely, she needed a date to go to events, and he was available. I think he was a brother of one of her friends. Anyway, I am now, when I was reading all this, I began to slowly formulate a wild hypothesis as to what may have happened next. Our story really comes to its very sad climax in November 1946. She'd been a bit odd since she came back from college, as she had spent part of the time at home, part of the time visiting her friend Elizabeth. Whenever Elizabeth went home, she always went to Elizabeth's home. She told Elizabeth that she didn't get on with her parents, that they were cold, and that there was no... But in fact, according to Elizabeth, the coldness was entirely on her side. her parents were actually quite devoted to her. They would call her and write to her and ask her questions about her courses and stuff. And she would simply respond with very, very short answers. She did not seem to want to have much to do with her parents anymore. In fact, she seems to have become closer to Elizabeth's parents, and she just seemed to want to spend all of her time with Elizabeth. And then it was Thanksgiving. The weekend before Thanksgiving, which was a holiday, that many of the students would travel home, but it was a long way for her to go back to New York, a couple of hundred miles. I was at 160 miles. At the end of the previous term, Elizabeth had joked to her, well, I'm going to take the train. Why don't you cycle home then, as you love your bike so much? And she said, okay then. So she phoned up her parents, told them she was going to cycle home. They let her, and she cycled 160 miles home from the end of term. Now, this is a woman on her own, probably staying a couple of nights, sleeping rough on the way, who just cycled across from Vermont to New York because she could, and because her friend had said, go on then, cycling. So she said, I will, and just did it to prove a point. She was fearless. There's no doubt about it. She was a brave woman, and she had a lot of dreams and hopes. Whatever they were, she did keep them to herself. The only person she seemed to confide in was Elizabeth. The two of them had a job together. They used to put on green uniforms early in the morning, dash across to the next hall of residence, which was the refectory where all the students would go to eat. And there they would be servers. And after they had served the food, they would dash back, wash up quickly, scrub, head off to lectures or lessons or whatever they were doing that day, or go for walks or go hiking together, etc., etc. And then they would come running back, serve dinner, and then head off again. And then in the evening, they would serve the evening meal. So they had different shifts, but most of the time they worked together. They were generally considered to be inseparable friends. In the run up to Thanksgiving, however, something went slightly wrong. Elizabeth seemed to be becoming more serious with one of the boys, and this seems perhaps to have slightly annoyed Paula. Whether or not there was anything to it, I'm not sure, but I just get the impression that there was something, because that weekend, the weekend before Thanksgiving, Paula stayed on her own. This was unknown. Elizabeth went home, and Paula mooched around, bored, depressed. Not many people were at the college, and those who were, she talked to, and she explained to several of them that she was fed up with Elizabeth because she'd gone without her, not invited her, and that she needed to make more friends other than Elizabeth, because, you know, at the end of the day, a girl can't have one friend if that friend is not going to be around when she needs it. There was some suggestion that she was really depressive. And as the week went on, Thursday, Thanksgiving was coming up, everyone was going home again. And her parents wanted her to come home, and she agreed to come home. And then at the last moment, she sent a telegram or a message saying, I'm not coming, something's cropped up. They never found out what that something was, but they assumed it was a boy. Doesn't seem to have been. And Elizabeth did stick around as well this time. No, I think Elizabeth went home for Thanksgiving without her again, but returned the next day. And when she got back, she found Paula in a really quite depressive state. She seemed annoyed, angry. But as the day went on, the two of them began to talk again. But really, there was something between them. There was something wrong. The Thursday, sorry, of Thanksgiving had not been a happy day. And as the weekend was approaching, well, there was clearly something wrong with Paula. And then it all goes horribly, horribly wrong. The night before the tragedy, Paula was in a good mood, it seems. She was downstairs and she was messing around with the girls, whether they were listening to the radio or playing records or doing whatever 1950s girls did, when she started a game they called Indian wrestling, which appears to have consisted of them all jumping on one another and grabbing one another and wrestling one another on the floor and pulling one another's hair and fighting and messing around and just, you know, tickling one another and giggling, which to me sounds like some kind of weird sexual thing, but I'm sure it actually wasn't. I'm sure it was totally innocent. But, you know, I would not be caught dead wrestling in front of a fireplace at Elveston Hall on a fur rug. Oh, sorry, that's D.H. Lawrence, Sons and Lovers, isn't it? Or Women in Love. I can't remember which one. No, no. Anyway, yeah, you know, it just seems a bit odd. But anyway, she ran upstairs and said, Elizabeth, Elizabeth, come down. We're all fighting and, you know, wrestling. Come and join in. So Elizabeth came down and she was laughing and everyone was shrieking with laughter. And they made so much noise that the girls on the top floor came down, who were the seniors, and told them to shut up and go to bed. Eventually, they were all still laughing. They piled back to their rooms and she went to her bed. Elizabeth was in the bed across the room. The two of them fell asleep. In the morning, she woke up and, oh yeah, I think the thing that had broken the ice with them was they both tended to oversleep. And Elizabeth would go over and pull her out of bed physically, or tip the bed and drop her down the side of the bed on the floor, which is presumably what you do to your best friend if you're girls, all girls together in a girls' college. It's probably not the kind of thing I would do. Whatever was going on, the situation was, you know, seemed to be back to normal. She seemed to be really happy on that last night. However, at lunchtime, the two of them were working together, and she asked Elizabeth if, as they had the afternoon off, she'd like to go for a walk. And she suggested that they could go for a hike in the woods, or go out to a cave, or go somewhere together, go for a walk. And Elizabeth said, no, no, because I don't finish till 2:30. You finish like 1:30, but I've got to do the washing up and stuff. Your shift stops ages before. By the time I get off, it'll be almost dark because this is December by this time, December the 5th, I think. So, you know, it's going to be really quite late. You don't want to go out, wait for me. Just go out now. And Elizabeth said to several of the other girls, hey, would you like to go out with Paula? Go for a walk with Paula. And all of them said, oh, we'd love to, but oh, we can't do it now. We've got other plans. And Paula seemed to get more and more depressed or put out the more Elizabeth tried to find somebody else to go with her. And eventually, at 2:30, Elizabeth thought, oh, well, Paula's probably going to wait for me anyway. We'll go into town. We'll do something. She got back to the room and Paula had left minutes before. She got back at 2:30, and we know that Paula left her room at just before 2:30. She had waited probably for Elizabeth, and Elizabeth had been distracted and hadn't made it back at the usual time. Something had happened, and by the time she got back, she was a few minutes late. Paula had walked out. Paula had put on a red coat, a blue pair of jeans, and she'd walked off to the end of the drive. Now, the college campus has got a really long drive, and opposite, there's a petrol station, and the young lad who's there notices this pretty blonde girl who he's seen before. He doesn't know her name, but he's like, oh, well, pretty blonde girl who I know, you know, smiles at her. I don't think he would have dared wave, but he stays and watches her. And she does a slightly odd thing. There is a mound of earth that's quite high with a tree on the top of it, to one side, and she clambers up this embankment till she's right on the top and stands staring back at the college. And he realizes that she's looking to see if someone's following her, and no one appears. And so she eventually shrugs and walks down, turns right, and heads into town. She's next seen walking towards the town centre, and she was seen approaching the bus station. Now, the bus station is actually on the route to where she ends up, or where we think she ends up. And she made her way through the centre of town. And it's incredible the number of people who could actually remember seeing her. There must have been something quite striking about her, possibly because she was wearing red, possibly because she was a pretty blonde girl, possibly because by this time it's 3 o'clock on a December afternoon and the light is beginning to fail. She walks through, gets to the other side of Bennington, and I'm going to have to go back to the map because that's going to make it much easier. I'll just go back a couple. And she basically, at this point, when I can actually find a map that shows what I need, she has left the college as a red dot. She's walked down into the town centre, past the bus station. She goes down here and she starts to walk out of town along a long road that is fringed by trees and forest. So she's walking down, I mean, it's Highway 7 or 9, I can't remember. I can't see either because my glasses are. Oh, it's 9, yeah. In those days, I think it was 67. But anyway, as she's walking along this road, she must have been quite a vulnerable figure. It's quite cold, it's getting quite dark, and she's just walking pointedly, fixedly forwards. And at some point, she encounters a young man who's driving a pickup truck who stops and says, "Where are you going?" And she says, "Oh, I need a lift. Can you give me a lift up to the long trail?" And he says, "Well, I live nearly all the way up there. I'll drop you off." So he drives up and drops her about here and goes in and has dinner with his wife. I would say he was the last person to see her alive, but there seem to have been quite a few witnesses thereafter. She walked up, and nowadays the long trail starts down here and goes up this way. But in this period, this road here, which takes up to where we just looked at, Bigfoot, etc., and the Devil's Hollow, was aligned with cabins. So she walks up the road past the cabins, and the people who lived in those houses and cabins, 3 or 4 of them come forward, and they can all give rough timings as, between 20 to 3 and 3 o'clock. And about 3 o'clock, 3:30, by which time it really is dim, she crosses over the planks here and is seen walking across and going up the trail into the forest. And that was the last ever seen of Paula Jean Weldon. She had seemed much happier the night before, but that day people who saw her did not feel that she was overly happy or didn't remark on it. A few people said she seemed perfectly normal. What they all agreed on was she was walking with a fixed purpose. But she walked into the woods and she was never seen again. Now, that cuts short a lot of the narrative because there was a tremendously long search for her. There were 5 aeroplanes used. There were hundreds of people involved. It made the search for Middy look like nothing. And every part of the woods was pulled apart. They absolutely searched their way through the forest. But this is an immense forest. Now, usually, if someone goes missing and they don't find the body in circumstances like this, it is because they did not look in the right place. And it is possible that she just walked up and crossed over Glastonbury Mountain and that her body still lies to this day somewhere on the other side. But if so, she would have been walking in the darkness. Whatever happened, Paula set off to walk along the long trail, 270 miles long, with no food, $10 in her pocket, no torch that we're aware of or other light source. And she just walked into the dark woods alone. That's a very strange behavior for a young girl, I think. Maybe not. Maybe some of you have done similar. I don't know. I was never a young girl. As she walked up that road, she passed these cabins, which is there today. These are probably modern replacements. And several of the people who lived there were able to explain that, yes, they had seen her. And you can see the kind of forest encroach. And this is the Harbour Road. It's named after the Harbour family who lived there. It stretches up. This is the route of the trail, the long trail. And for this part, it's an actual road. And as she was walking up, there was a chap and his girlfriend having a fantastically heated argument. And the girl stormed off into the house, and the chap got in his car and drove off. And he didn't come back until some time later. And in years to come, he has been accused by many people, because he apparently joked about knowing to within 100 yards where she was buried. But it was suggested that in a fit of pique, he killed her, possibly ran her down, possibly. No one knows. I don't know, because I know that the police really did try their hardest to get their heads around it and to cross-examine everyone who'd seen her at the time. And I think that there were some soldiers who were there earlier in the day up this road camping, and they were hauled in and were cross-examined, even though they had a girl with them, or the 3 of them from New York. They were cross-examined for 5 hours, despite the fact they'd left before she even left the campus. So it wasn't like the police didn't actually make an attempt. Over here on the left, you can see the river, and you can see at this period, as I said, there was just a plank bridge. Now, the river here looks quite fast, but it doesn't look that deep, does it? So did she fall into the river? Well, if so, we would have expected her to have been found during the search. Let's keep going up. Well, next. What if she went off the path? Well, eventually the path turns into this. It starts to head up towards Glastonbury Mountain. And if you imagine if she had suffered a fall or had come to an accident in the darkness and slipped, and she'd ended up in this kind of terrain, would you find her? Maybe at the time, though, one of the things that can happen quite quickly is animals predate and they scatter the bones. There's another particularly horrible way that people die in deep snow, which is, I'll explain it to you quickly because there was a very famous case a year or so before this, about 100 miles further south in New York State. A young woman went to see her grandmother and she went for a walk and she went into the woods and she literally just walked around the block, hardly any distance at all. And she was not seen again. Now it was snowy weather, and 2 years later, they found her skull, which was wedged in a crook of a tree. And that caused a great mystery until they found out that a man walking his dog had found the skull and had placed the skull in the tree. And from the description, they were able to recover the body. And sadly, what happened almost certainly to her was the following. And this is something that might save your life one day, so I may as well tell you it. If you're ever out in deep snow or skiing, a large number of people every year meet their fate by going close to trees. Now, if you imagine a tree has got branches that go out, especially an evergreen, and that provide a certain degree of shelter, what happens is when the snow piles up, the snow does not pile up around the base of the tree. So you've got deep snow and then a sudden pit. And as it gets deeper and deeper, eventually what will happen is it will reach the point where the wind will blow it across and it will freeze over. So you have a deep pit which circles the tree. And people on skis in particular tend to ski down. And if they approach the tree too closely, they break through the snow, plunge down, their heads go down, their feet are stuck above them. They can't turn the right way up and they die. And if people go towards a tree seeking shelter, which is a natural thing to do if you're in the snow and you're trying to find somewhere to rest, it's all too easy to plummet 6 to 8 feet down in the snow and end up down by the roots of the tree, unable to get out properly. Now, because it's cold and it's wet and it's icy and it will freeze, and you're trying to clamber up against a tree, you would have thought you'd get out, but not everyone does. And I think the Americans record 75 deaths a year using that particular scenario. That seems to have been what happened to the girl in New York State. Is that what happened to Paula? Probably not. There wasn't enough snow. There was a scattering of snow, but that night the temperature dropped. It was about 40 degrees. It was 10 degrees centigrade, I think, actually, when she was walking into the woods, about 40 degrees Fahrenheit as the sun was going down. It'd been quite a warm day. But that night, it rapidly dropped to just about the freezing point, and it began to snow, and there was really heavy snowfall throughout the night. Is it really a great mystery that Paula was never seen again? The mystery for Paula is like the Uber 5. Not where did she go, because I think we all know she walked into the forest and something befell her there. She might have been murdered, but to me, the real mystery is why a girl who was depressed, emotional, and clearly out of sorts chose to walk off into a massive forest on her own, rather than you wouldn't go hiking under those conditions. And I cannot help but feel that she may have been, if not planning self-harm, at least recklessly endangering herself by her actions because she didn't care, because she was so upset about something. And as I probably hinted in my presentation of the facts, I believe that the thing she was upset about was her friend Elizabeth. I think that she had strong feelings for Elizabeth that may have gone beyond friendship, and that she was finding it very difficult. And actually, I do wonder if Shirley Jackson, when she wrote her book, actually knew more from campus gossip or from the lecturers about some incident that may have occurred to her, because her parents' behavior, at times rather strange, while they looked for her. Now, I'm not going to blame the parents. We've all seen that done in the case of Madeleine McCann. That's insane. I think the parents did the absolute best they could for her. But it's clear that there may have been some kind of traumatic incident that had occurred to her in New York. Shirley Jackson's book has that as the catalyst for her disappearance. I don't know if she had access to information we don't. I don't think the state police ever considered that an option in the slightest. But I think she walked out into those woods and probably sat down under a tree when she was tired and it snowed, and she would get up, but then she began to feel comfortable and her arms and legs became warm and she fell into a deep sleep and hypothermia claimed her. It's strange that they didn't find any of her clothing. Paradoxical undressing is common in these cases. It's strange they didn't find any evidence of her. There was an incredibly large search, but to be honest, as I said, the number of times that searchers actually find someone is a tiny fraction of the number you would be led to expect by detective dramas. Even if the person is there, there was a nurse who sadly harmed herself, she took some tablets and fell asleep on Hardwick Heath in Bury St Edmunds in the 1970s. And it was 25 years before she was found under the tree where she just laid down. And yet everything was there. She was just laid there. But no one found her, even though this is an area that people walk through, near the old Hardwick Hall, even though it's behind one of the largest hospitals, the largest hospital in Suffolk and one of the largest in England, I think. So, how could that happen? Well, the answer is not many people walk off the paths and just go off unless they're going for a wee or something. And it only takes, a sheer chance that someone finds her. Luckily, she was intact. Her body was where it had been for 20 years. But in many cases, under the leaf debris. So, is this paranormal? No. No. If you went into these woods at night with snow falling around you, with a jacket on and a pair of jeans, would you come out? And the answer for me would be probably not. I'm not that good at outdoor survival. She was young, she was extremely fit, but I think whatever was going on with her, it precipitated a crisis. There is another possibility, which is that she simply left, and rather than walk into these woods at night, the suggestion is that she walked up the long trail and met someone. And that person had a car. She jumped in the car and went off and formed a happy life elsewhere. And if so, and she's watching this, she's 88 now. I wish her the very best. And, sorry if I've slandered or upset you, but I hope you had a fantastic life and it all went well. But looking at this terrain, I do not think you need to invoke Sasquatch or aliens or UFOs or the Bennington Triangle. So what was she like? She was a mystery. We don't know exactly what she was about or what she was doing, and maybe that's what she wants, to remain like that forever. Maybe her secret should stay. So who's next? Next, 68-year-old veteran missing after boarding bus in St Albans City. 3 hours north of Bennington, there is a small city called St Albans, not the one obviously in England. And on a particularly snowy, cold night, isn't it always, a man by the name of James Tedford, jumped into the bus. James had been living at the soldiers' home there, and he had been unwell. He had been suffering from a little bit of, he was only 68, but I think his mind was wandering, shall we say. And he'd been a bit out of sorts. And his wife, who was much younger than him, but loved him very dearly, so it was said, had decided that the best thing for him was for him to go to the veterans' home and be properly nursed. So he was staying at the soldiers' home. But he would be allowed to go home and visit his wife in Franklin, which is to the south of Bennington. And he would take the bus down, stay with her for a couple of days, and then come back. Now, this is a veteran. This is a soldier who served his country. He was regarded well. He was liked, but he was also getting on a bit. Only 68. Perhaps he had early onset Alzheimer's or dementia, but whatever it was, he was becoming frail and forgetful. On the day in question, he jumped on the bus, rode off into the night, and the story goes there were only 14 people on the bus. The bus journey is about 2.5, 3 hours. 3 hours seems to be the standard rate. They're coming down Highway 7. There's a handful of stops, and everybody else has got off the bus, and the 14 remaining people can see him with his kit bag, with his grey army overcoat. And I think he took out a map at one point and looked at it. And then the bus pulls up at Bennington, and he's gone, leaving behind his kit bag and his coat and his maps. He's just no longer there, and he's never seen again. Now, that is actually quite a creepy story, isn't it? That really does sound paranormal. The problem with the story is that it leaves out a few significant facts. Now, if I had more time, let's just check what the time is. If I had more time, I would go into detail about it and explain exactly why I think this possibly wasn't paranormal. The important thing was that this is the first newspaper article about his disappearance on December the 7th, which was the day that, note, the police here have just discovered that he failed to return as scheduled last Thursday. For 6 days, he's been missing. Now, admittedly, he disappeared 3 years after Paula, almost to the day, in fact, probably on the same day. And it does seem strange on the face of it. He was on a bus. The bus doesn't stop or stops very infrequently. Everybody around him finds his possessions. The possessions are left on the bus, but he isn't on the bus. The problem is the story's been improved in the telling. 6 days were left after his relatives walked him to the bus stop. Maybe they were waving him off. Maybe they were making sure he got on the right bus. Did the bus driver stop from time to time to have a wee in the massive forests that comprise almost the whole distance? I mean, my little artist rendition here is an AI thing I've knocked up just to show you the idea of a bus going in snow, simply because I thought it'd be useful to give you that impression. Imagine the bus pulled over. In those days, they wouldn't have had toilets on board. Did he jump off the bus, walk into the woods to have a wee with the driver? The driver got in and drove off and didn't realise. Did he slip on the ice, hit his head, and never come back to the bus? Did he get off simply at the stop before? And was his possessions taken with him? Well, he certainly took his overcoat with him because he was still wearing it when, according to the description, he took his cap with him. Did he leave his kit bag? Maybe. But those elements cut into the story later. The original sources only tell us that he disappeared. Sadly, I've not been able to find any reference to him being found, but my guess is that James Tedford turned up and was reunited with his wife. The police may never have been notified, or if they were notified, they may have simply not bothered to write it on the case notes because it didn't matter because he was back. I reckon that James Tedford was found. I feel that anyone who's in America who'd like to check that should do so, because I think that would be a really interesting thing. I don't think it would have been covered by the papers, but I have discovered that in many missing persons cases, even some on the Charlie Project, from time to time, it turns out that the person actually came home, but no one notified the authorities. Now, if he had wandered off in a fit of absent-mindedism, his wife, much younger than him, almost certainly would have made an effort to find him. And let's face it, a 68-year-old veteran, I think they would have found him, unless it was a medical episode. And as I said, he walked into the woods because he got off to have to go to the loo. So sadly, one of the creepiest ghost stories of the whole lot doesn't seem to be as first presented. Now, I'm not blaming Joseph Citro here because he tends to be very accurate in his presentation of the facts. Certainly, Dooley, even more, Dooley absolutely spot on, never exaggerates anything, completely flat, really good detailed analysis. And in fact, more and more, we're beginning to see that in some of the TikTokers. But there is a massive wave of sensationalist mystifiers and mysterious who are trying to make this sound much, much, much more mysterious than it is. You don't need to add Sasquatch abducting people. You don't need to have the aliens beaming this guy off the bus. All of these cases are genuine mysteries. I'm going to move on because I know people have got to go do other stuff and so have I. Sadly, this is one of the cases I'm going to talk about least. Paul Jetson was 8 years old. He suffered from a learning disorder. And his learning disorder, whatever it was a bit of a liability. His mum and dad looked after him pretty well, and they kept pigs which grazed on the city dump, which is about 2 miles outside the town centre. And you can see one of the pigs here. His mother had come out to move some of the pigs from one paddock to another. She left him in a pickup truck for an hour, and when she came back, he'd gone. He was wearing a kind of form Davy Crockett outfit, beige and form, and as his father kept saying, if he'd wandered off into the woods at this time of year, well, we might never find him. That was in November. He never was found, and in fact, Bewildered, who's a Patreon this is from, I've included at the top, she's an Italian blogger, and she believes that the father's extraordinarily exaggerated demeanor suggests that he knew more than he let on. I think that's unfair, and again, I hate blaming families, but she believes that her opinion she puts forward on this case is that the mother and father found the boy just far too much like hard work, and sadly this has happened. I mean, we do know it happens. Nobody wants to believe it happens, but one of the stats that I found most fascinating from the femicide census, for those who don't know, the femicide census is an invaluable piece of work done by British women who are researching the murder of women and how male partners are often responsible. The chances you will be attacked if you're a woman and killed by a stranger are pretty much exactly the same as the chances you'll be killed by your own mother after the age of 5. So, children aged 5 and above and adult women are as likely to be killed by their mother as by a strange man on the streets. About 11 or 12 cases a year. I find that really depressing. But we just deny it happens. We don't believe these things happen, and we don't believe that parents become so utterly frustrated that occasionally they harm their own children. I don't think that happened here. I think what actually happened here was that for an hour, a little boy who was bored was left. He might have got out, he might have chased a pig, he might have wandered off, he might have suffered all kinds of accidents because dumps are not safe places. And tragically, they never found him. I don't know if he fell and hurt himself, and I'm not going to make the obvious comments about pigs because I don't think pigs don't tend to like eating bodies. I know everyone says that's how you dispose of people you don't like, but sadly, I don't think that's true. Having grown up with pigs, I found them remarkably fussy about what they ate. They do like sweets, though. So this is another story that sadly just does not appear to have any paranormal elements at all. It's just a very, very, very sad tragedy about a little boy who got lost, and in my opinion, came to a natural end. And in the opinion of Bewildered, there was a sinister thing. But, bloggers will always suggest conspiracy when there is nothing of the sort. Finally, Frida Langer, the last one on our list, 1950. Frida was out with some mates, and she was out with some chaps. I believe it was her husband, his brother, another bloke. They were staying in a cabin, they were drinking, they were having a good time, they were hunting, and she knew her way around. They'd been there many times over the years. It was their holiday cabin. And they went out for a walk, and they hadn't gone very far into the woods when she fell over. And she landed in one of those streams I showed you. She was soaking wet, and she turned around and said, I'm going to go back and get changed. I'll meet you in a while. So I'll see you shortly. I've got to go. And she went back. And when the others got back, she didn't catch up with them. And when the others got back that evening, they assumed she'd be, at the cabin, having changed and dried off and maybe had a drink and sat down or made some food. There was no sign of her. So getting a bit freaked out, knowing the history of the location, they went out into the woods looking for her. And once again, Bennington was the center of an incredible search effort. Aircraft, helicopters, absolutely all manner of things were brought in. And by this time, Vermont has finally got its act together and organized a state police. Up until this point, searches were by county, and because the county line splits the area in a number of ways, depending on where you were and how many people from that county knew who you were or cared enough, depended on the effort of, searching. So the state police could coordinate all that and made searches much more efficient. Even so, they searched a large area, and according to most websites on the Bennington Triangle, they had searched the very spot where she was found. 2 years later, 2 years, 6 months later, Freda's body was found. She was again by a stream. She'd fallen, maybe. No one knows. There was no signs of brutality or damage, but she appeared to have expired, possibly from exposure, having walked in the woods. It was impossible to tell, but her body was recovered. So of our 5 missing persons, one of them was found dead in the woods, and that took 2.5 years. The reason it took 2.5 years was she was 3.5 miles from where she left her friends and from her campsite. And she'd gone in the other direction. She'd gone down towards the main road, I think. So she was nowhere near where they left her. And obviously there was suspicion. There were all kinds of accusations leveled at the men who were with her. But I think those eventually faded out. And Freda's story is one where we have closure. And I just wanted to include a picture of her because I thought, even if she wasn't mysteriously zapped off the planet by aliens or Bigfoot or whatever, her sad death in 1950, the year that my parents got married, was worth remembering. So to another sad loss of life. So, what causes the Bennington Triangle? Is it aliens? Could be. I mean, I'm not saying it was aliens, but, and actually, there might just be something in there. What? CJ in Aliens Exist Horror? No, not that's not really me, is it? But those woods are bloody dark and scary. And if there was anywhere, well, does Bigfoot live there? I find that very hard to believe. New England Bigfoot? Pacific Northwest, surely. Could it be some kind of other cryptid? Could be. More likely, could it actually just come down to being a serial killer? Could be. But whatever's going on out there, it is deeply, deeply weird. Or is it? Is it just stats and bad luck and the fact it's a huge expanse of forest next to a small college town? Is it this just about normal? But why 5 cases in 5 years? Is there a link? Is there any kind of, you go back to the Pennacook and the other Indian tribes who live there, Native Americans, sorry, we say nowadays, is there any link between those traditional beliefs and this? And the answer seems to me to be probably not. But there is a story about alien abduction. 1930, February 1930. H.P. Lovecraft, Howard Phillips Lovecraft, sat down to write a new story. The story, he had decided, would be something very different. Now, Lovecraft had, throughout his life, written what I call ideas stories. Although he's often regarded as a horror writer or even a fantasy writer with his Dreamlands pastiches, which are in the style of Lord Dunsany, H.P. Lovecraft actually wrote science fiction. His stories are about big ideas, time travel, alien races. The Silurian hypothesis, which takes its name not from the geological epoch, but from the notion that in the ancient dim past, there were other races who lived on Earth, and that our archaeology has not discovered traces of them because they've been destroyed by millions of years of geological action. It's named after the Silurians from Doctor Who. So with that in mind, the Silurian hypothesis could easily have been called the Lovecraftian hypothesis. He imagined a world which, for 60 or 70 million years, had been peopled by a succession of races who had achieved the same kind of marvels in many cases, or even more technological advance than humanity. They had their own cultures, and then they had died off. They had become extinct. And if you think of Great Cthulhu as a hyper-intelligent dinosaur from outer space, I mean, that's basically what he is. He's a highly intelligent dinosaur who survives and sleeps and wakes till one day he'll reawaken and come out of cold storage and destroy humanity. But one of Lovecraft's heroes or villains, depending on which way you want to look at them, is a race of creatures called the fungi from Yuggoth. And I had a load of fun trying to make fungi from Yuggoth earlier. I couldn't get them to work. I couldn't get the heads to glow. They kept giving them eyes. But I wanted to create something like what Lovecraft describes. And these creatures on the left are roughly what he describes. The fungi are funguses, intelligent funguses who can fly through interstellar space. They go dormant as they pass through from one star system to another, so they traverse vast distances. I believe they may have started off in the Magellanic Clouds, but now they're on Earth. And on Earth, they are seeking out rare minerals, it's believed, and they have a secret society which serves them. They have the capacity to take human brains out of the body and place them in artificial devices, brain canisters, with which they can fly them to other worlds and show them the mysteries of other planets. And they are an alien race who are abducting humans for their own purposes. They're masters of maybe genetic manipulation. They take on the form of humans, but they speak with horrible buzzing accents. And the interesting thing about them is that they are the story, The Whisper in the Darkness, where they are most prominently featured. I mean, they also appear in a sonnet cycle called The Fungi from Yuggoth, is set near Brattleboro in the Vermont woods or in the Massachusetts-Vermont border. And Newfane, which is where they are said to have one of their major bases, is just to the north of Glastonbury Mountain. So quite by chance, H.P. Lovecraft comes up with a whole body of folklore in 1930, a pseudo-folklore that he invents, as far as I know, about the Indians having a tradition of these strange creatures in the woods. And when there's a flood, the bodies are sometimes washed down in the great Vermont floods of 27, I think it is. The bodies are washed down and the locals, bury them as quickly as they can or just choose not to look at them. They melt away, fortunately, when exposed to sunlight, I believe. But these creatures live in the mountains and they are responsible for disappearances. Lovecraft's stories, actually in 1945, have just appeared for the first time in a slim volume, which was published by, I think the US Army actually was one of the first publishers of it, but by Arkham House. And paper shortages during the war had meant that they had been largely restricted to Weird Tales magazine. But the fact that the fungi from Yuggoth are actually inhabitants of, or very close neighbors of, the Bennington Triangle is something that I find really interesting. Lovecraft was a massive skeptic. He would have been a member of PSYCOP if he was alive today. He was writing at the time of his death, or the lead up to his death, till Houdini died, actually, so a few years before his death. He was writing a book with Houdini and with one of his friends called The Cancer of Superstition, in which he argued against the occult, against newspaper horoscopes, which he thought were utter bilge, and he hated them. Lovecraft despised any kind of paranormal belief, but he found it really good and fun thing to write about. And in fact, the impression he was quite disturbed by it. I think he really did find his hatred of seafood comes through quite heavily as well in Great Cthulhu, in the fungi, and in creatures like that. But his research was actually very shallow. When he invented his mythical book, the Necronomicon, when he invented his occult traditions, he did not actually bother to go and, read up on them. he took his Encyclopedia Britannica, 13th edition, 1904, I think it was, and he read the article on magic, and that was it. The rest of it was pure imagination. There are occasionally real names or real parts of pagan mythology or things he's taken from the Arabian Nights, but most of what he takes, he makes up wholesale. However, he did have one journey which formed the inspiration for the Whisper in the Darkness, when he went to visit a friend who lived in the mountains west of Brattleboro. And did he learn some kind of strange upcountry folklore there? Was there an existing tradition? That is for people like Joseph Citro, who's a passionate, bold, and fascinating folklorist whose ghost story books are really worth reading. And that's where people like Michael Dooley, who's a fine historian and a careful academic chronicler who debunks most of this nonsense in a very rigorous way, the two of them would agree that what we need to do is go back to the sources, go back to before the invention of the triangle, and just try and honestly resolve this weird Lovecraftian mystery. Did Lovecraft know something that we don't? Was there really a tradition of something in the woods that took people away? Was there something calling to Paula when she walked down that dark path? No, I don't think so. I think it's just coincidence. But nonetheless, it was too close a coincidence. The first story that I'm aware of that deals with the motif of alien abduction, certainly the first one which involves consciousness and the brain being transferred out of the body and into other bodies, and alien minds being put in human shells. Pioneering science fiction stories about all kinds of, hard sci-fi concepts and philosophical concepts, but a rather weak plot. The Whisper in the Darkness is a fantastic little story. I, however, would recommend the film. 2011, made in the style of a 1930s talkie. It begins with Charles Fort giving a lecture, which is an abomination because it's, rewritten the plot, but it works beautifully, so I forgive them. It doesn't have to be pure to Lovecraft. The rest of the story is pretty much. A few years before, they did a black and white silent version of The Call of Cthulhu. That's well worth looking up. But if you can find The Whisper in the Darkness, hint, it's probably on YouTube. And as my friends who backed it are never going to see any money from this now, I don't think anyone's going to mind. Mind you, talk to Sandy Peterson and others about that. But I'm not quite sure what happened, but something went wrong. But yeah, either buy yourself a copy if you've got the money from the H.P. Lovecraft Society, H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, HPLHS, or just grab it off the internet, YouTube, and have a look at it because it's a fun film. And that, my friends, was the Bennington Triangle. And I hope you feel that at least I tried to give the case justice and tried to show respect to those who've died there. And I'm sorry that it turned out not to be as mysterious or as spooky as maybe Brown Mountain, the Brown Mountain Lights and the Bridgewater Triangle. But that would be another story. I think it would be remiss of me to not end by just saying thank you for the last decade. I've been part of ASSAP, as you know, and I was the chair. Recent events have caused me to leave. I've now got a little Facebook group where I am posting the news articles I used to post on the ASSAP one, and I will do some webinars there. In a week or two's time, I'm planning to start a series of lessons, a simple introduction to parapsychology. It will be this kind of stuff, but it will actually include some of the academic parapsychology I used to teach. And if anyone's interested in that, that will be available. But hunt me out. You can find me on Facebook or you can find me by email. Nice to see you all. Have a good weekend and take care. It's been a lot of fun. I have now completed my last of my ASSAP webinars. And so on that note, I will bid you well. Questions if there are any.
Thank you, CJ. That was a beautiful webinar, very sympathetically told, I think, when it comes to all of the